So then what you need to do is think about the people involved and who you're providing a review to and what decisions they're trying to make. So these next few slides are aimed a little bit more at understanding those things. And for the sake of ease, what I'm doing is focusing in on three of the most common examples, I think, within our community, and that's journals, conferences, and workshops. And with conferences, I'm mainly talking about a full research paper at those conferences. We could go into talking about all different types of things you submit to conferences, like posters, late-breaking work, workshop proposals, panel discussions. Those all have their own levels of formality and expectation, which involves a lot more discussion. And with more time and more opportunity, we could discuss those, but not in this video. So the key people involved in a journal is typically the editor-in-chief, who's in charge of the whole journal, the deputy editor, who's often working with the editor-in-chief to try and manage the review process to make sure papers are going through the journal review process properly with the right people and the right timing, that type of thing. There's the associate editors, which is their wording for senior reviewer. Let's say that as a common term: senior reviewer, associate editor, and their job is to get the paper appropriately reviewed, and then also to start to make decisions about whether it would be accepted. And then, with everyone's help, actually reviewers in that process as well. With a conference, you typically have different people involved. You have a general chair who's running the whole conference. They've got all sorts of things in their mind, like budget and location. There's typically the papers chairs, and those papers chairs are in charge of the papers being properly reviewed and the right papers being selected and published that year. That makes sense. Sometimes you might have what's called a theme chair, and those theme chairs might be supervising an area of the conference. So in one conference I was in, there was kind of three themes. There was people, systems, and then studies. And so it was kind of like which theme, there was one person responsible for what counted as quality in each of those areas. And in CHI, what we have, for example, is subcommittee chairs, and they are responsible for one of like 18 different sections of the CHI conference. And other conferences have similar breakdowns often. And then working for those theme chairs or subcommittee chairs, you have the senior reviewers, which are often called associate chairs. Lots of confusing terminology, but associate chairs or associate editors is typically senior reviewers. Let's go for that. And then reviewers. In a workshop, it's often a lot more informal. There's often like maybe a half a dozen organizers who are informally organizing all the things like how the workshop will be organized, what papers are included, that type of thing. They're just kind of doing all the jobs together. And they might be doing all the reviewing just amongst themselves. They might invite some reviewers, but ultimately they're kind of acting as the senior reviewers and the papers chairs and the organizers all together in one kind of mix, which is often a lot more curated as a process. So each of those groups of people are working in these different bigger processes. So it's important to know where you and they all fit in that process, so that you know what you're doing when you provide a review, and you know what they're going to do with that information, and what will happen after you've submitted your review. And so I'm going to show you a few diagrams, which are sort of taken from different places. Some I've created and some have come online. And one thing that's important to notice about these diagrams is that typically in the diagrams, there's like a vertical column. And that vertical column is like a role. There might be a vertical column for authors, one for senior reviewers, one for reviewers, and so on. So look out for that mentally as you're looking at these. So this was a diagram that was produced by one large publisher, which was Elsevier, and they have this kind of diagram at one point that they produced. And it's interesting to look at this type of diagram. You can often find this type of guidance or this type of explanation or diagram, hopefully with most publishers, if you want to go and find it, or if not, you should be able to ask a senior reviewer or a deputy editor or editor-in-chief to how their process works if you want to know. In this case, they're imagining that an author submits to a journal, and then initially a question is asked, does this fit our journal? And if no, then sometimes, a lot of the time, papers just rejected from journals, because journals are kind of editing a set of relevant themes to their journal. So they have the freedom to just say, doesn't fit our journal, and reject stuff straight away. The editor can then do a the editor-in-chief, or sometimes the deputy editor, or some more senior person involved in the process, often then does an initial evaluation of the paper to decide if it meets the minimum bar of quality expected by the journal. And they have the authority in that process to make that judgment and also reject stuff off to the left there that they decide is not meeting the minimum bar of quality to be considered by a review. If it's worthy for review, if it meets that bar of quality, then that's when it goes out to the right there as being invited for expert review. And those reviewers agree to review and then send a review to the editor. And at that point, the editor's got full choice to decide what happens next. Does it get rejected? Do we ask them to revise and make changes, or do we accept it? And that goes back to the author. That's fine. The authors typically provide revisions. It's rare that something gets straight accepted without any revisions. There's typically something that could be tweaked or improved or corrected, like even a typo. And then it comes back to the editor, and the editor will say, we'll then look at it to decide if it's then accepted or not, whether it needs more revisions. So it can actually go out for another revision cycle, or it could be accepted and rejected at that point. And in terms of number of times it could be revised, we'll find that sometimes journals have like a limit. So one of the journals I work with has like a limit of 2 sets of major revisions. And if it's not getting on track after 2 sets of revisions, then at that point it would be rejected and given no more chances to revise. So as a reviewer, if you're in this process, you know that the editor has already decided typically that this is relevant to the journal and meets the minimum bar of quality, and then that's why it's got to you. So you don't have to make necessarily those judgments unless you think they've missed something obvious. So then you're really reviewing to say, is it ready to accept yet or not, or does it need more revisions? But you should know if you say it needs more revisions, typically what's going to happen later is they're going to receive the revisions, and then they're going to ask you to re-review those revisions. So working with a journal and with some conferences that have a change cycle, you're going to imagine that you expect to see this paper again, to review it again to see if it's got better. Comparatively, a workshop, the process is much smaller. Everything is kind of like authors submit papers to the workshop, which is typically a small paper. Organizers can reject some stuff if it's out of scope if they want, but otherwise they start reviewing it themselves. Maybe 2 of the organizers look at each paper and say, yeah, that looks good. That one's not really relevant, so we'll keep this one, not that one. They might ask reviewers to help, which is possible. But if they have not too many papers and enough people on the organizing team, they may not seek external reviews. Kind of depends on how big the workshop has got. And then the organizers decide what's accepted or not, and then they let the authors know, and there's kind of no more faffing around than that. That's kind of everything involved in the process. So what I'm going to show you next is the process behind HCI, which is big and complicated. And I can't really do this for every conference out there, but hopefully this shows you an example of big scope for a big conference and then smaller process for a smaller conference after that. So this is currently the process for HCI, which is increasingly big. It's one of the biggest venues in our field. There's several we have that are big conferences, and this is one of them. And it has, a continuously developed process to put papers through fairly and to get good reviewing as they go. So it starts off with the author submitting a paper, and then the papers chairs, subcommittee chairs, associate chairs all then get a chance to look at that paper before it goes out to review to identify if there's a reason to desk reject it. So you can typically imagine that already desk reject reasons have been considered by those more senior levels, papers chairs, senior reviewers, and then those senior reviewers have invited you. So you provide your review. And then what that's going to do is lead to a discussion that the associate chairs, senior reviewers, initiate. And so they might say, thank you for your reviews. I understand these points. I don't understand that. And they ask you to engage in a discussion about what you've said, especially if there's different opinions, which happens a lot. One thing you should accept as a reviewer is that you're providing a perspective from your expertise about a paper. And especially if a paper is multidisciplinary, there might be differing perspectives. So that's really important that people comprehend each other's reviews through that discussion process. The AC will then write a meta review, and that will then get sent up to the papers chairs, and the papers chairs will wait till all the meta reviews are in, and then they'll be making a kind of threshold decision at that point. if a paper is below a threshold and not nobody is recommending it for revise and resubmit or accept, then it just gets rejected at that point. But anything that looks like it could be improved for publishing gets sent to the author for revision. The author revises the paper, and then once they submit it by the next deadline, it goes back to the senior reviewers, and the senior reviewers re-invite you as a reviewer to check the improvements, especially if there's improvements you requested. And again, there should be discussion about that. So it's a review and a discussion second cycle. And then together, the papers chairs, subcommittee chairs, and associate chairs all have these large PC meetings, decision meetings, where these are discussed and they decide which papers through that second revision now meet the bar for acceptance. And then the authors get that decision afterwards. So you can see that's a fairly elaborate process, and you're providing kind of one step as a reviewer on the side to help ACs do their jobs. And those ACs are helping the subcommittee chair do their job, and those subcommittee chairs are helping the papers chairs make decisions about papers. So there's this levels up that your advice is being read by. If you want to narrow it down to perhaps a smaller conference, they typically will skip out some of these steps. So there may not be subcommittee chairs, it may be just the papers chairs and the senior reviewers working together. So that cuts out one column. And then if there's not a revision cycle, then typically there's all that lower half is kind of gone. It's just you write your review, you get involved in discussion, the senior reviewer writes the meta review, and that goes to the papers chairs to decide which ones get accepted. And then you get accepted or not. You know, that's all there is. There's no more to it after that. So you can see as conferences grow, they might decide to elaborate on this process. You can see here the difference there between what's added in the CHI process to make it revise and resubmit and therefore refereed status. So that was all complicated. You can hopefully pause and look at those anytime you want to get an understanding of those processes. But this leads us to understand what are the concerns of each of those people, because each of those people are doing a task or doing a role, and they want something from you as a reviewer to help them do that role. So the editor-in-chief, for example, is interested in a journal to making sure good papers are accepted to the journal and that they are rigorously reviewed and that they are reviewed relatively, as quick as possible for their process. So they're concerned about statistics and quality and making sure the journal has a good reputation. So part of your job as a reviewer is to be quick for them and to help it maintain a reputation of good quality. So you're part of that quality. The senior reviewer is the one who is the associate editor is trying to make the decisions about the paper. So your job there is to try and help them make a decision about the paper. Does it need revisions? You're helping them make that choice. Does it need revisions, or is it ready to accept now? So everything you write in your review is helping them decide that question. For conferences, the general chair wants a good conference, but they're not necessarily involved in the reviewing of the papers. They want good papers to be part of their good conference, but they delegate that decision about good papers to the papers chairs. Along with the theme chairs, they're sort of who are helping make that responsibility, that quality management through different themes within the conference. So then there's the senior reviewers, and their sole job really is to, with reviewers, decide if a paper meets the bar of quality. And so in this case for conferences, you're not saying, does it need changes? You're saying, does it meet the bar? And so your review is reasons why it does or does not meet the bar right now. So already there's a difference there between what you're trying to say. For a journal, you're trying to say, does this need more changes, and what reason does it need those changes? For a conference, you're saying, is it ready now? Is it good now? Or does it need to be improved and submitted to a future conference? With workshops, because they're informally organized, really what they want is an interesting discussion, and they want anything submitted to that workshop to help provoke an interesting discussion. And so their criteria for what they want is more about, is it interesting? Will it be good to talk about at the workshop? So if you're providing a review to a workshop, typically it's of that nature. Is this interesting? Is it a novel idea? Will lots of people talk about it? That type of thing. So there's a slide there that roughly says those things. The journal, there's little sense of time. They just need to know what revisions might be needed. For the conference, they need to know, because they've got to make a decision in 2 weeks' time, is it in or out? And you're helping them make that decision. And then workshop, how would they involve it in the workshop? Would it be interesting to talk about? So building our previous version of the slide. So we said so far this means you need to understand the type of thing you're reviewing, the pressures behind those decisions, and the relative bars of quality. You also then, to be a good reviewer, need to understand what the senior reviewers want from you in this case, and what decision they are making in order so that you can help them make that decision. So really all this means together is that we're hoping as a reviewer, you've come to some understanding of those aspects for the situation, so that when I invite you to be a reviewer for my workshop, and it's going to be on this topic, you're helping me make the right decisions for that. I'm not saying this isn't a fully studied full research paper, because that's not what we're expecting to receive to our workshop, and so on. Ultimately, what the senior reviewers want is a recommendation from you to help them make their decision. Clear reasoning about your recommendation, because if there's no clear reasoning about it, it's hard for them to understand your recommendation. Then sometimes they want you to provide guiding numbers to help rank the paper relative to other papers. And one bit of good advice that Benjamin Gorman sent me, also through what used to be Twitter, was it's really important to highlight both the positives and negatives, but in the end, you need to advocate for either accepting or rejecting one way or the other, or it being ready or not ready for a journal. And it doesn't really help anybody to sit on the fence. This isn't helpful for the senior reviewer if you're not making a recommendation, because they can't make a recommendation from a non-recommendation. So just before we finish on this video, the one thing we haven't really mentioned so far is anonymity. And it's worth just putting a little bit of knowledge in about anonymity, because there's different levels of anonymity that are built into review processes. And this will help you understand maybe why they have them. So some journals typically are single anonymous. It used to be called single blind. We try to use the word single anonymous now. And this is where the names of the reviewers are hidden from the author, but the author submits with their name on the paper. This is a more traditional way of reviewing, the most common type across the wider academic field. And this is good. It allows for reviewers to be anonymous and make impartial decisions, recommendations without feeling bad of what the author might think about them, if that makes sense. The downside to this, though, is that it's easy to hide, for reviewers to hide behind this anonymity. And so what we hope is a good reviewer with integrity is that you are making good recommendations about papers, but not necessarily using this to your advantage. So sometimes one critique of single anonymous review processes is that reviewers will be harsh or rude because they forget that, ultimately there's a kind of a human behind the process, behind the paper. And so because nobody will know who they are, they kind of maybe forget the politeness that is useful to be constructive as a reviewer. Some authors also think that it's possible that a conflicted reviewer might delay their paper maliciously, but we hope this isn't. We don't believe reviewers in our field are regularly doing this, because we have confidence in the integrity of our community. But what happens sometimes because of that is that we have double anonymous review. So this is where both the reviewer and the author are anonymous. People don't know who is who. And this is designed to make sure that the prestige of the author isn't influencing a process, which is another way around something might happen. So it might be that reviewers are initially biased by seeing the papers from a well-known professor, and then they might say, well, it's from a well-known professor, presumably it's good in the first place, which isn't always true. We see plenty of papers that have a well-known HCI academic as one of the authors, not a specific HCI academic, I mean well-known academics more generally, but there's something wrong with the paper and they get even desk rejected or rejected through review. So just because someone is an established academic doesn't mean that all their papers are going to pass the review process. The only downside of this is that this is kind of it's true that we hopefully don't reveal the author, but it's kind of obvious sometimes where a paper has come from. I can say for all of the work done during my PhD was on a particular piece of software. It was called MSpace. And it was pretty evident to anybody reviewing a paper on MSpace that it was probably from the team that I was a part of. And you just can't get around that type of academic familiarity, because people in your field you want to be an expert, who are reviewing your paper, typically know the literature in the field. And so although it's good to try and have this non-anonymity level, there's limits to how well that works. Sometimes it's obvious as well from all the Wilson et al. Papers I cited in my paper, which is the work I know best, I guess. So sometimes it's evident from the most cited author who the author is, but the idea behind double anonymous review is that that's at least maintained plausibly, that there's anonymity behind it. The third type of thing you might sometimes see is open review. And with open review, this is where everyone is known, no one is anonymous. And then they believe this is the best way to avoid, for example, malicious reviewers, because you can't hide behind anonymity, and for everyone to be submitting work they're proud of because the authors are known as well in the review process. They're not submitting work that isn't quite finished because it was visible to everybody who it's from. So people believe this open review process can establish more openness across everybody. One of the downsides is that because there isn't anonymity behind there, sometimes people are less honest. So you can be polite but still honest and say this paper is not good, and the authors, and then you don't feel bad next time you see the author at a conference. So each of these modes is has its pros and cons, is what we're saying, and you should make sure you know which one is relevant for the place you're reviewing for, because then it might be one reason that something is desk rejected if it's not anonymized properly. And one mistake you can sometimes make, which I've done in the past, is sign off a comment in a discussion with my name, and then suddenly I've revealed my name as a reviewer to the other reviewers, which you're not supposed to do. But knowing the anonymity level you're working in is a good step of understanding for you to be there. So that's everything to the end of part one. And what we're hoping you got from this is a clear understanding that different types of papers submitted to different types of venues, like conferences and journals, need to be reviewed in different ways. And so for you to be a good reviewer, hopefully you can understand what the expectation is for you as a reviewer, so that you can meet that expectation well and help the right people make the right decision, which is ultimately what you're doing as a reviewer.